The screaming stopped 3 days ago, but the smell never will. I am Commissar Thaddeus Vorn, and I write these words with hands that shake not from fear but from the simple biological impossibility of what I have witnessed on the world of Kepler's Gate. The Departamento Munitorum will file this report in some forgotten archive, another casualty statistic in the endless ledgers of imperial bureaucracy. They will read the numbers. 4.2 billion dead, planetary infrastructure 97% destroyed, tithe grade reclassified to perditus, and they will understand nothing. Numbers cannot capture the sound a human being makes when an orc tears them in half while they are still conscious. Statistics cannot record the way an entire civilization dies, not in glorious battle, but in systematic brutality that reduces mankind's greatest works to smoking rubble and scattered bones. The data scribes will log the orbital bombardment that finally cleansed Kepler's Gate, marking it as a successful resolution to a minor orc incursion. They will never know that we burned our own people alive to prevent something worse than death, but I know. I was there when the green tide swept across 7 continents. I watched proud regiments of the Imperial Guard break and run as primitive aliens carved through them with crude weapons and bestial fury. I stood in the command bunker beneath Hive Tertius and listened to the last Vox transmissions from the outer districts as human voices dissolved into screams of pain and terror. I saw what remains when orcs are finished with a world. This is not a tale of heroic last stands or glorious sacrifice in the Emperor's name. This is the truth about what happens when the galaxy's most prolific killers descend upon an unprepared world. When crude technology meets infinite brutality. When the green tide rolls forward and leaves nothing but devastation in its wake. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning local time, when the orbital monitoring stations detected unregistered contacts at the edge of the Kepler system. Navigator Prima Castell initially classified them as debris fields, possibly the remnants of some ancient battle drifting through the void. The signatures were too scattered, too chaotic to represent organized shipping or military vessels. Even when the contacts began to accelerate in system, our analysts dismissed them as asteroids caught in gravitational fields. We should have known better, should have recognized the signature chaos of orc technology, the complete disregard for basic engineering principles that somehow produces functional spacecraft. But Kepler's Gate had been a peaceful world for over 3 centuries. Our defenses were designed to repel pirates and the occasional rogue trader, not to face a full-scale alien invasion. The first wave hit the outer system 68 hours later, 17 separate craft. If the twisted scrap metal and barely controlled explosions that served as orc ships could be called craft. They moved with the kind of reckless abandon that should have torn them apart. Their drives operating beyond any safe parameter, their hulls groaning under stresses that would destroy proper imperial vessels. But they held together through sheer bloody-minded determination and the incomprehensible physics that govern orc technology. Defense Platform Sigma engaged them at maximum range, its lance batteries reaching out to touch the lead vessels with beams of coherent energy that could vaporize a cruiser-class warship. The first shot struck true, punching through the orc craft's crude armor and setting off secondary explosions that lit up the darkness between worlds. For a moment, our spirits rose. Perhaps these aliens would be as easy to kill as their ramshackle ships suggested. The burning orc vessel didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't even seem to notice that half its hull had been vaporized by our attack. It continued its course toward the defense platform, trailing fire and debris while more orcs poured from its ruptured compartments into the void. They wore no environmental suits, carried no breathing apparatus. They simply existed in hard vacuum for the few minutes it took their ship to complete its attack run, screaming soundlessly as they fired crude weapons at our installations. The other orc craft followed similar patterns, absorbing punishment that should have destroyed them while maintaining their assault. Some lost entire sections to our defensive fire. Others broke apart completely, their hulks spinning away into space. But the survivors kept coming, their crews apparently unconcerned by casualties or damage, driven by a simple desire to close with their enemies and engage in the brutal combat that defined their species. Defense platform Sigma managed to destroy 11 of the attacking vessels before the remaining 6 closed to boarding range. What followed was not warfare in any sense that Imperial doctrine would recognize. It was slaughter, pure and simple. The orcs cut through the station's blast doors with crude welding torches and explosive charges, pouring into corridors filled with naval personnel who had trained for ship-to-ship combat, not close quarters fighting against alien berserkers. The distress calls from Sigma lasted exactly 43 minutes. Then the station went silent, its defensive weapons turned against the inner system installations as the orcs figured out how to operate our own technology. They weren't subtle about it. Where Imperial crews would have used the lance batteries to disable key targets while preserving infrastructure, the orcs simply fired at everything that looked interesting. Orbital shipyards, communication relays, traffic control stations, all of them vanished in brief flashes of vaporized metal and escaping atmosphere. But the real horror was yet to come. The first orc assault had been a scouting force, a probe to test our defenses and clear the way for what followed. 3 days later, as we struggled to re-establish contact with our outer system assets, the Auspex operators detected new contacts at the system's edge. Not 17 this time, not dozens, hundreds. The main orc fleet was a floating monument to everything wrong with alien technology. Massive ship-like constructs held together with rivets and faith, their hulls bristling with weapon systems that had no business functioning. Some of the vessels were clearly built around captured Imperial ships, their clean lines corrupted by orc modifications that added extra armor, oversized engines, and weapon mounts that looked like they had been installed with mining equipment. Others defied classification entirely, geometric impossibilities of twisted metal and scrap that moved through space despite having no visible means of propulsion. At the center of this mobile scrapyard lurked something that made even seasoned naval officers question their sanity. The orc flagship was built around the hulk of an Imperial battleship, but the aliens had modified it beyond recognition. Its prow had been replaced with a massive ram shaped like a snarling orc face. Its sides bristled with gun batteries that fired projectiles the size of ground cars. Most disturbing of all, it was covered with crude paintings and graffiti that seemed to shift and move when observed directly, as if the ship itself was alive and trying to intimidate its enemies. Governor Malthorn convened an emergency session of the Planetary Council as the orc fleet approached our world. The assembled nobles and administrators sat in their comfortable chairs, sipping recaf and debating response strategies as if they were dealing with a trade dispute or budget allocation. They spoke of negotiation, of diplomatic solutions, of the possibility that these aliens might be reasoned with if approached correctly. I tried to explain what we were facing. Orcs don't negotiate. They don't want territory or resources or political concessions. They want violence, pure and simple. They live for war, thrive on conflict, exist only to fight and kill and destroy. Attempting to negotiate with them would be like trying to bargain with a natural disaster. But the council had read the intelligence briefings. They knew that orcs were primitive, disorganized, easily confused by complex tactics. They believed that superior Imperial technology and training would carry the day, that our disciplined forces would quickly overwhelm the alien rabble. They authorized a defensive strategy based on orbital interdiction, confident that our remaining naval assets could prevent the orcs from reaching the planet's surface. They were wrong. The Battle of Kepler's Gate began at 0347 hours local time when the orc fleet engaged our orbital defenses. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense, but a masterclass in controlled chaos. The orcs attacked without formation, without coordination, without any of the tactical sophistication that marked proper naval warfare. Individual ships would break away from the main fleet to engage whatever targets caught their attention, sometimes firing on their own allies in their eagerness to get into combat. It should have been a disaster for them. Our naval commanders, trained in the finest academies and veteran of dozens of engagements, should have been able to use superior coordination and tactics to defeat the alien rabble. They positioned our remaining cruisers to create overlapping fields of fire, established kill zones where concentrated firepower could destroy the enemy vessels, implemented communication protocols that allowed for precise coordination between multiple ships. None of it mattered. The orcs didn't follow the rules of naval warfare. They didn't try to preserve their ships or minimize casualties. They simply charged forward with engines at maximum burn, firing everything they had while screaming challenges over open communication channels. When their weapons ran out of ammunition, they used their ships as giant projectiles, ramming into our vessels with complete disregard for their own survival. The cruiser Righteous Fury was the first to fall. It had maintained perfect formation, its guns firing with mechanical precision at the approaching orc vessels. Its crew followed proper gunnery procedures, targeting the largest enemy ships first and focusing their fire to ensure maximum effectiveness. They destroyed 3 orc craft in the first exchange, their lance batteries punching through alien armor like tissue paper. Then an orc ship that should have been dead, its hull breached in a dozen places and its engines trailing fire, completed its ramming run. The impact drove the alien vessel's prow completely through the Fury's armored hull, the 2 ships locking together in a deadly embrace. What followed was a boarding action that lasted 6 hours and ended with the Fury's distress beacon going silent. When we finally regained visual contact, the proud Imperial cruiser was flying orc colors and firing on its own former allies. The pattern repeated throughout the engagement. Our ships would inflict terrible damage on the attacking orcs, only to discover that alien technology operated according to different principles than Imperial engineering. Vessels that should have been crippled continued fighting. Engines that should have exploded kept providing thrust. Weapon systems kept firing even after their power sources had been destroyed. More importantly, the orcs didn't seem to care about losses. When a ship was destroyed, its crew would cheer and fire their weapons until the last moment, treating their own deaths as part of the entertainment. When ships were captured, the surviving crew would join their captors and help turn their own vessels' weapons against former allies. They fought with the enthusiasm of people attending a celebration rather than the grim determination of soldiers defending their homes. By the end of the first day, half our orbital fleet was gone. The survivors fell back to defensive positions around the planet's major space installations, hoping to use the fixed fortifications to even the odds. It was a sound tactical decision, exactly what Imperial naval doctrine recommended in such circumstances. The space platforms had heavier armor and more powerful weapons than our ships, and their position allowed them to create overlapping defensive fire that should have stopped any assault. The orcs bypassed them entirely. Instead of engaging our remaining defenses, the bulk of their fleet simply ignored our installations and proceeded directly to planetary orbit. Our commanders found themselves in the impossible position of watching the enemy land troops on the surface, while their own forces remained tied up defending installations that the orcs no longer cared about attacking. The first dropships hit the surface at 1423 hours, landing in the agricultural districts outside Hive Primus with all the subtlety of falling meteors. These weren't the precision deployment systems used by Imperial forces, but crude metal boxes designed to survive impact rather than deliver troops in fighting condition. Many of them buried themselves dozens of meters underground, their crews presumably killed by the sheer force of landing. It didn't matter. The orcs who survived their descent immediately began doing what orcs do best: fighting, building, and preparing for more fighting. Within hours of landing, they had established crude defensive positions around their drop zones. using salvaged metal and whatever materials they could find to construct fortifications that looked more like scrap piles than military installations. The PDF responded according to standard doctrine, deploying armored units to contain the landing sites before the aliens could establish proper beachheads. The 23rd Kepler Armored Regiment rolled out from their garrison bases, their Lehman Russ battle tanks and Chimera transports forming up in perfect parade ground formation. They were good soldiers, well-trained and properly equipped, veterans of anti-piracy operations and peacekeeping missions across the sector. They had never faced orcs before. The first engagement took place in the Tertius Valley, where elements of the 23rd encountered an orc raiding party that had emerged from the Grimskull landing site. The Imperial force consisted of 12 Lehman Russ tanks supported by infantry and Chimera transports. A textbook combined arms formation designed to maximize firepower while maintaining tactical flexibility. They established firing positions on the high ground overlooking the valley. Their long-range guns trained on the approaches the orcs would have to use. The orcs didn't use the approaches. They came straight up the cliff face, climbing sheer rock walls with their bare hands while carrying weapons that should have been too heavy for infantry to manage. When they reached the top, they didn't seek cover or attempt to establish firing positions. They simply charged directly at the Imperial armor, screaming battle cries and firing crude weapons from the hip. It should have been a massacre. 12 main battle tanks against perhaps 50 orc infantry in open ground. The outcome should never have been in doubt. The Lehman Russ crews opened fire with their battle cannons, each shot powerful enough to destroy an entire squad of infantry. The impacts were perfect, high explosive shells detonating in the midst of the orc charge and throwing alien bodies in all directions. The orcs kept coming. The survivors of each blast simply stepped over their fallen comrades and continued their advance. Their enthusiasm apparently increased by the violence around them. When they closed to short range, they began firing weapons that defied classification. Crude projectile throwers that spat metal slugs the size of a man's fist. Energy weapons that crackled with barely contained power. Explosive devices that were thrown by hand with devastating accuracy. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. When it was over, every Imperial vehicle was either destroyed or captured. The crews who survived the initial fighting were dragged from their machines and subjected to treatment that I will not describe in detail. The Vox recordings from the scene were sealed by direct order of the planetary governor, but not before several of us heard enough to understand what we were truly facing. Orcs don't just kill their enemies. They enjoy it. They take pleasure in the act of violence itself, turning combat into a form of twisted entertainment. The screams coming through the communication system weren't just the sounds of men dying. They were the sounds of creatures being used for sport by aliens who viewed suffering as amusement. But worse than the fate of the tank crews was what happened to their equipment. Within hours of the engagement's end, our reconnaissance flight spotted the captured Lehman Russ tanks moving under orc control. The aliens had somehow figured out how to operate Imperial technology despite having no formal training and no understanding of basic mechanical principles. They drove the tanks with reckless abandon, treating them like toys rather than precision military equipment. More disturbing still, they had begun modifying the vehicles according to their own aesthetic preferences. Gun barrels were painted with crude decorations. Armor plates were covered with orc graffiti. Most unsettling of all, they had somehow managed to increase the tank's rate of fire, their weapons cycling faster than Imperial specifications should have allowed. The same pattern repeated across all the initial landing sites. PDF forces would engage the orcs using proper Imperial tactics, only to discover that their enemies didn't fight according to any recognizable doctrine. They were unpredictable, chaotic, seemingly immune to fear or pain. Worse, they learned from every encounter, adapting their crude technology to counter Imperial weapons and tactics. Within 72 hours of the initial landing, we had lost contact with 3 entire PDF regiments. The orcs controlled a dozen major landing sites and were expanding their territory at an alarming rate. Most concerning of all, they were getting organized. What had begun as scattered raiding parties was coalescing into larger formations with recognizable command structures. This was when we learned the truth about orc society. They weren't just random savages, they were a military civilization, one that operated according to principles that made perfect sense from their perspective. Strength determined leadership, size determined status. The biggest, strongest, most violent orcs naturally rose to positions of authority, and their followers obeyed them not out of loyalty or duty, but because they offered the best chance of finding good fights. The largest of the orc warlords was a creature that called itself Scarjaw the Red. Intelligence reports suggested it stood over 3 meters tall and was covered in crude cybernetic modifications that increased its already formidable physical capabilities. It had claimed the crashed remains of one of our orbital defense platforms as its base of operations, and from there it was coordinating attacks across the entire continent. Under Scarjaw's leadership, the scattered orc raids began to focus into organized campaigns. Instead of simply attacking whatever targets were closest, they began striking at infrastructure. Power plants, water treatment facilities, transportation networks, all the systems that kept Imperial civilization functioning became priority targets for orc assault forces. The attacks were devastating, not because they were sophisticated, but because they were utterly without restraint. When orcs assaulted a power station, they didn't attempt to capture it intact. They simply destroyed everything they could reach, turning vital infrastructure into twisted wreckage. When they hit transportation networks, they didn't just disable the vehicles. They turned the wreckage into improvised weapons and fortifications. Most disturbing of all was their treatment of civilian populations. Imperial doctrine assumes that even alien enemies will follow certain basic rules about non-combatants, if only because preserving infrastructure and population centers serves strategic purposes. Orcs followed no such limitations. They saw every human being as a potential source of entertainment, regardless of age, gender, or combat capability. The refugee streams began 3 days after the initial landing, as civilian populations fled the advancing orc forces. What we saw in those columns of desperate humanity broke something fundamental in our understanding of how war was supposed to work. These weren't just people who had lost their homes. They were the survivors of systematic brutality that treated human suffering as sport. Children who had watched their parents used for target practice. Women who had been subjected to tortures that I lacked the vocabulary to describe. Men who had been forced to fight each other for orc amusement while their families watched. All of them bore the marks of encounters with creatures that viewed violence as entertainment and human pain as comedy. The PDF established refugee camps in the outer districts of Hive Primus, trying to provide medical care and basic necessities for the displaced populations. But many of the refugees were beyond help, their minds broken by experiences that no human psyche was designed to endure. The medical staff worked around the clock, but their efforts were focused on keeping people alive, rather than treating the deeper psychological wounds that might never heal. Dr. Melina Vash, the senior medical officer at Camp Delta, tried to explain what she was seeing to the Planetary Council. The refugees weren't just physically injured, they had been systematically terrorized by creatures that understood human psychology well enough to inflict maximum psychological damage. The orcs weren't randomly violent. They were deliberately cruel, calibrating their brutality to create the greatest possible fear and despair. "They're not fighting a war," she reported during one of the emergency council sessions. "They're putting on a show. They want witnesses. They want survivors who can spread stories about what they're capable of. Every act of violence is designed to terrorize the population and make resistance seem hopeless." Her words fell on deaf ears. The council was still operating under the assumption that this was a conventional military situation that could be resolved through proper application of imperial doctrine. They authorized the deployment of additional PDF regiments, called for reinforcements from neighboring systems, and began planning counterattacks that would drive the aliens back to their landing sites. None of them understood that we were fighting an enemy that grew stronger through combat. Every engagement, win or lose, provided the orcs with more weapons, more vehicles, more resources to fuel their expansion. They didn't need supply lines or logistics support. They simply took whatever they needed from their enemies and used it better than its original owners ever had. The first major counterattack began on day 7 of the invasion. 3 full PDF regiments, supported by orbital bombardment and close air support, advanced on the Grimskull landing site with orders to eliminate the orc presence and reclaim the territory. It was a textbook operation, planned according to established Imperial doctrine and executed by competent officers who understood their equipment and their enemy. The 12th Kepler Infantry led the assault, their companies advancing in proper formation while heavy weapons teams provided covering fire. Behind them, the 8th Armored Regiment maintained overwatch positions, their tank guns ready to engage any orc vehicles that emerged to contest the advance. Above them, Valkyrie gunships provided close air support, their multi-lasers and rocket pods ready to suppress enemy positions. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. The PDF advanced steadily, their weapons cutting down the scattered orc sentries that opposed them. The aliens seemed disorganized, their defensive positions crude and poorly sighted. Several company commanders reported that the enemy appeared to be in full retreat, abandoning their fortifications without offering significant resistance. It was a trap, though not in any sense that Imperial tactical doctrine would recognize. The orcs weren't retreating because they were beaten. They were withdrawing because they wanted to draw the Imperial forces deeper into their territory. They had spent the previous week turning the entire landing site into a massive kill zone, using salvaged materials to create interconnected defensive positions that would channel attackers into predetermined areas. The first sign of trouble came when the lead companies reached the perimeter of the orc base. Instead of the crude scrap metal fortifications they expected, they found sophisticated defensive works that incorporated salvaged Imperial technology. Tank traps made from twisted chimera hulls, firing positions built around captured heavy weapons, communication trenches that connected multiple strong points into a unified defensive network. The orcs had learned from their previous encounters with Imperial forces. They understood how PDF tactics worked, what kind of formations Imperial troops used, how to predict and counter standard assault procedures. More disturbing still, they had figured out how to use captured Imperial equipment more effectively than its original operators. When the trap was sprung, the PDF found themselves caught in a crossfire from weapons they had built themselves. Captured Imperial vehicles, modified with additional armor and oversized weapons, emerged from concealed positions to engage the attacking forces at point-blank range. The air support that should have provided covering fire was neutralized by surface-to-air missiles that the orcs had somehow constructed from salvaged components. But the real horror wasn't the tactical situation. It was the realization that the orcs were enjoying themselves. Their communications traffic, broadcast on open channels for everyone to hear, was filled with laughter and crude jokes. They were treating the engagement like a game, competing with each other to see who could score the most kills or capture the most interesting prisoners. The 12th Infantry broke first, their companies dissolving into chaos as individual soldiers realized that they were being used for entertainment rather than engaged in proper warfare. Some tried to surrender only to discover that orcs had no interest in accepting formal capitulation. Others attempted to fight their way out of the kill zone, but found themselves facing enemies that seemed to anticipate every move. The retreat became a rout as surviving PDF elements fled the engagement area, abandoning their equipment and their wounded in their desperation to escape. Behind them, the sounds of orc celebration could be heard across the entire battlefield, crude songs and rhythmic chanting that spoke of victory and conquest and the joy of successful violence. When the casualty reports came in, the numbers were staggering. 3 regiments had been effectively destroyed, their surviving personnel scattered across the countryside or captured by the enemy. Worse still, the orcs had gained access to enough Imperial equipment to outfit several additional formations. Their technological capabilities increased exponentially by their battlefield success. Governor Malthorn finally began to understand what we were facing. This wasn't a conventional invasion that could be repelled through military action. It was a cancer that grew stronger with each engagement, feeding on the resources and population of the world it was consuming. Every Imperial victory provided the orcs with more material to work with. Every Imperial defeat gave them more territory to exploit. The decision to call for assistance from the Astra Militarum was made on day 10 of the invasion. By then, the orcs controlled approximately 40% of the planet's surface, their territory expanding daily as new landing sites opened and existing bases sent out raiding parties to claim additional resources. The PDF was reduced to defensive operations around major population centers, their effectiveness compromised by equipment shortages and collapsing morale. The request for aid was transmitted on the highest priority channels available to planetary government, marked with emergency codes that should have triggered immediate response from Sector Command. We asked for a full Guard regiment, supported by Imperial Navy assets and equipped for extended anti-orc operations. What we needed was enough military force to contain the alien expansion and begin the slow process of reclaiming our world. What we got was a single company of Cadian shock troops, transported by a light cruiser that was already overextended from previous assignments. Company Commander Dracus was apologetic but realistic about his limitations. His men were good soldiers, veterans of dozens of campaigns against various enemies of the Imperium. But they were 100 men trying to solve a problem that required thousands. "We're not here to win your war," he explained during his briefing to the Planetary Council. "We're here to buy you time. Time to evacuate your population centers. Time to destroy anything the orcs can use. Time to prepare this world for exterminatus, if that becomes necessary." Exterminatus. The word fell into the council chamber like a physical blow, silencing the assembled nobles and administrators who had been arguing about supply allocations and defensive strategies. The ultimate sanction, the complete destruction of a world deemed too corrupted or dangerous to be allowed to continue existing. It was a theoretical concept to most of us, something that happened to other worlds in other sectors when truly desperate measures became necessary. Commander Dracus continued his briefing with clinical detachment. Orc infestations follow predictable patterns. They establish beachheads, consolidate their gains, then use their captured resources to launch expansion waves that consume entire star systems. Left unchecked, the force that has landed on your world will grow into a wire that threatens every Imperial installation within 50 light years. He activated a hololith projector that displayed tactical information about orc expansion patterns, showing how a single successful landing could metastasize into a sector-wide catastrophe. The mathematics were unforgiving. Every day the aliens remained on our world increased their potential threat level exponentially. Every piece of Imperial equipment they captured became a force multiplier for future operations. The standard response is immediate containment followed by systematic eradication, Dracus explained. When that's not possible, the affected world is sterilized to prevent the contamination from spreading. My company is here to determine which option applies to your situation. The evaluation process took 3 days. during which Drakus and his men conducted reconnaissance missions into Orc-controlled territory. What they found confirmed our worst fears about the scale of the infestation. The aliens hadn't just captured territory, they had begun transforming it according to their own needs and preferences. Entire cities had been converted into massive fortresses, their architecture modified to accommodate Orc sensibilities about defense and aesthetics. Industrial facilities had been repurposed to produce crude but effective weapons and vehicles, their output optimized for quantity rather than quality. Most disturbing of all, the Orcs had established breeding facilities where they were rapidly expanding their population using biological processes that Imperial science struggled to understand. "It's already too late for conventional containment," Drakus reported to an emergency session of the Planetary Council. "The infestation has reached critical mass. They're producing new warriors faster than any conventional force can eliminate them, and their industrial capacity is expanding daily. Within 6 months, they'll have enough strength to launch off-world expeditions." The implications were clear even to the most optimistic council members. Kepler's Gate was lost. The only question was whether its destruction could prevent the Orc plague from spreading to neighboring worlds. The decision about exterminatus would be made by higher authorities, but the preliminary steps could begin immediately. Evacuation protocols had been theoretical concepts until that moment. Every Imperial world maintained plans for emergency population relocation, but they were designed for natural disasters or conventional warfare, not for the systematic consumption of an entire planet by alien parasites. The logistics of moving billions of people off-world were staggering even under ideal conditions. We had 5 days. The evacuation began with the essential personnel, government officials, military commanders, technical specialists whose skills were deemed critical for Imperial operations elsewhere. These people had access to private transportation and the resources necessary to secure passage off-world before the general population began to panic. They departed quietly, their absence carefully concealed to prevent social breakdown. The second wave consisted of what the administratum classified as high-value civilians. Wealthy merchants, influential families, skilled artisans whose capabilities justified the expense of emergency evacuation. These people had the personal wealth necessary to purchase space on the limited number of transport vessels available, though the prices demanded by ship captains willing to approach a war zone were astronomical. The third wave should have been the general population, transported in massive bulk carriers that could move thousands of people per trip. But there weren't enough ships. The Imperial Navy had no vessels to spare for civilian evacuation, and commercial carriers were unwilling to risk their ships approaching a world under active alien attack. The few captains who accepted emergency contracts demanded payment in advance and guaranteed nothing beyond basic transportation to the nearest Imperial world, which left approximately 3.8 billion people with nowhere to go. The refugee camps around the major hives swelled beyond capacity as the evacuation priority system became public knowledge. Desperate families sold everything they owned for the slim chance of securing passage off-world, only to discover that there was simply no room for them on any departing vessel. The lucky few who obtained transportation found themselves crammed into cargo holds with minimal life support, but even these uncomfortable accommodations were better than the fate that awaited those left behind. Civil order began to break down as the scope of the situation became clear. When people realized that only a tiny fraction of the population could be evacuated, that the vast majority were being abandoned to whatever mercy Orcs might show, the careful social structures that had maintained peace for centuries simply collapsed. Rioting began in the refugee camps and spread to the hive cities as millions of desperate people competed for resources that could never be sufficient for their needs. The PDF was forced to choose between maintaining civil order and preparing defenses against the advancing Orcs. Many units simply dissolved as their personnel abandoned their posts to attempt securing transportation for their own families. Others turned their weapons on the civilian population they were supposed to protect, shooting rioters who threatened the evacuation sites where the privileged few waited for transport. I was assigned to oversee the evacuation of Hive Tertius, the planet's third largest population center. My orders were clear: maintain order by any means necessary, ensure that priority personnel reached their assigned transports, and prepare the city for destruction once all useful assets had been removed. The final point was delivered without emotion by Governor Malthorn's aide, as if discussing the demolition of an obsolete warehouse rather than the murder of 15 million Imperial citizens. The Hive was a monument to human engineering, its towering spires reaching kilometers into the sky while its foundations burrowed deep into the planetary crust. Generations of architects and engineers had collaborated on its construction, creating living spaces for millions of people and industrial facilities that had provided prosperity for the entire sector. Now it was being prepared for systematic destruction, its infrastructure rigged with explosive charges that would ensure nothing useful remained for Orc exploitation. The demolition teams worked with mechanical precision, placing charges at critical structural points throughout the Hive. They followed procedures developed by the Imperial engineers, protocols designed to bring down massive structures while minimizing collateral damage to surrounding areas. But there would be no surrounding areas to protect. The entire planet was being prepared for sterilization. The civilian population of Hive Tertius received 12 hours' notice to evacuate. Not to evacuate the planet, that was impossible for all but a few thousand people, but simply to flee the city before it was destroyed. 15 million people were told to walk away from the only homes they had ever known, taking only what they could carry and seek shelter in the countryside where they might survive a few additional days before the Orcs reached them. The Exodus was a sight that will haunt me until my dying day. Endless streams of humanity flowing out of the Hive's exits, carrying children and invalids and whatever possessions they thought might help them survive in the wilderness. They moved with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that their time was measured in hours, not days. Behind them, the great spires of their former home were being systematically prepared for demolition. Some of them tried to return, families who remembered forgotten possessions. Individuals who decided that death in their homes was preferable to slow starvation in refugee camps. The PDF units guarding the evacuation routes had orders to prevent anyone from re-entering the Hive, using lethal force if necessary. I watched good soldiers shoot down civilians whose only crime was wanting to die in familiar surroundings rather than alien wastelands. The charges detonated at exactly 1800 hours local time, 3 hours after the last transport lifted off from the evacuation sites. The explosion was visible from orbit, a flower of light and debris that marked the end of 3 centuries of human achievement. The Hive's towering spires collapsed in sequence, their structural supports severed by precisely placed demolition charges. Within minutes, 15 million homes had been reduced to rubble and smoke, but the destruction served its purpose. When Orc advance forces reached the site 12 hours later, they found only twisted wreckage and scattered debris. There were no intact buildings to convert into fortifications, no functional infrastructure to support a major base, no population to exploit for entertainment or slave labor. The aliens spent 2 days picking through the ruins before moving on to more promising targets. The pattern was repeated across the planet as Imperial forces implemented a scorched earth strategy designed to deny the Orcs any useful resources. Industrial facilities were destroyed rather than captured. Population centers were evacuated and demolished. Transportation networks were systematically sabotaged to prevent their use by alien forces. It was the right decision from a strategic perspective. Every piece of infrastructure we destroyed was one less asset the Orcs could use to fuel their expansion. Every population center we evacuated was thousands of fewer people who could be enslaved or used for entertainment. The policy was logical, necessary, and completely in accordance with established imperial doctrine for dealing with orc infestations. It was also the systematic murder of our own civilization. By day 15 of the invasion, we had destroyed more of our own world than the orcs had. Our defensive strategy had reduced billions of people to refugees, eliminated the industrial base that had made the planet valuable to the Imperium, and turned centuries of human achievement into rubble. We had saved nothing except the principle that imperial resources should not fall into alien hands. The orcs adapted to our scorched earth tactics with typical efficiency. If they couldn't capture existing infrastructure, they would build their own. If they couldn't enslave existing populations, they would import their own workers. The alien landing sites began to expand as massive construction projects created fortifications and industrial facilities from scrap metal and salvaged materials. Most disturbing of all was their treatment of the refugee population scattered across the countryside. Instead of simply killing the displaced civilians, the orcs began capturing them for purposes that our intelligence services struggled to understand. Entire refugee camps would disappear overnight, their former inhabitants transported to alien facilities where they were put to work on projects that defied classification. The few survivors who escaped from orc captivity brought reports of construction activities that violated every principle of engineering and physics. They described massive structures being built according to no recognizable architectural plan, their geometry impossible to comprehend and their purpose completely opaque. Human prisoners were being used as laborers, but also as components in mechanical devices whose function remained unclear. Dr. Vash, who had been treating refugees since the invasion began, tried to make sense of what the survivors were describing. "They're not building factories or military installations," she reported during one of our final intelligence briefings. "They're creating something else, something that incorporates living beings as functional elements. The prisoners aren't just working on the construction, they're being built into it." The implications were too horrible to consider directly. The orcs weren't just conquering our world, they were transforming it into something that no longer qualified as human habitation. The refugees who had survived the initial invasion were being converted into components in alien machines whose purpose served needs that human minds couldn't comprehend. Commander Dracus made his final report to Sector Command on day 18 of the invasion. His assessment was uncompromising. The planet was completely compromised. The orc infestation had reached irreversible levels, and immediate exterminatus was the only option that could prevent sector-wide contamination. His recommendation was supported by detailed tactical analyses, resource assessments, and population surveys that documented the complete breakdown of imperial authority. The response came back within 6 hours. Authorized. Exterminatus protocols had been developed over millennia of warfare against enemies that threatened not just individual worlds but the survival of humanity itself. The procedures were designed to ensure complete sterilization of planetary surfaces, eliminating all biological life and rendering the affected world permanently uninhabitable. It was the ultimate expression of imperial ruthlessness, the willingness to sacrifice anything and everything in service of mankind's survival. The execution fell to Captain Mordian of the Imperial Navy cruiser Righteous Vengeance. His ship had arrived in system 4 hours after the authorization came through, its holds loaded with cyclonic torpedoes designed for planetary sterilization. These weapons were artifacts of humanity's darkest technological achievements, each one capable of cracking continents and boiling oceans. The final evacuation took place over a period of 6 hours, as the few remaining Imperial personnel were lifted from the planet's surface to waiting transport vessels. There was no room for civilian populations, no time to save anyone who hadn't already been designated as essential personnel. The lucky few who secured passage off-world watched their home disappear beneath them, knowing that everyone they had ever known was about to die. I was among the last to leave, my duties as commissar requiring me to ensure that all Imperial assets were properly secured before departure. As our transport climbed toward orbit, I looked down at the world that had been my home for 15 years. The continents were scarred with the marks of war. Burned cities, cratered battlefields, the geometric patterns of orc construction projects that violated human sensibilities about proper architecture. From space, the devastation was even more apparent. The planet's night side glowed with the fires of burning cities and industrial facilities, while its day side showed the brown smudges of atmospheric contamination where alien activities had poisoned the air itself. What had been a garden world was now a monument to the galaxy's capacity for destruction. The bombardment began at Oro 300 hours ship time, as the Righteous Vengeance launched its full payload of cyclonic torpedoes. 12 weapons, each one powerful enough to shatter mountains, descended toward predetermined impact points across the planet's surface. The detonations were visible from across the system, brief stars that flared to life and then faded, leaving behind craters that would remain visible for geological ages. The first torpedoes targeted the major orc installations, their fusion warheads vaporizing the alien constructions and everything within hundreds of kilometers of their impact points. The subsequent weapons were aimed at seismic fault lines and volcanic systems, their explosions designed to trigger planetary disasters that would complete the sterilization process begun by the initial strikes. Within hours, the world was convulsing with earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that split continents and boiled seas. The atmosphere itself caught fire as the oxygen content reached combustible levels, creating firestorms that swept around the globe at supersonic speeds. By the end of the first day, nothing remained alive on the planetary surface except the cockroaches and bacteria that could survive in any environment. The orcs died with their usual enthusiasm, their final Vox transmissions filled with appreciation for the spectacular destruction being visited upon them. Even in their last moments, they seemed to view the planet's annihilation as entertainment rather than catastrophe. Some of them were apparently trying to construct crude spacecraft to escape the bombardment, though their efforts were rendered irrelevant by the scale of the destruction. The official reports listed Kepler's Gate as successfully cleansed of alien contamination, its threat to sector security permanently eliminated. The casualty figures were recorded as acceptable losses given the strategic necessities involved. The survivors were processed through standard refugee protocols and assigned to new worlds where their skills could serve Imperial needs. But the numbers couldn't capture what we had actually lost. A world that had served the Imperium faithfully for over 3 millennia had been erased from existence. Billions of loyal Imperial citizens had died not in glorious battle, but as casualties in a strategic calculation that weighed their lives against sector security. The cultural achievements of centuries, the architectural marvels that had taken generations to build, the accumulated wisdom of entire civilizations, all of it had been reduced to radioactive ash in the space of a few hours. Most disturbing of all was the realization that this was considered a successful operation. We had prevented the orc infestation from spreading to other worlds, denied the aliens the resources they would have used to launch sector-wide campaigns, and eliminated a potential staging ground for future invasions. From the perspective of galactic strategy, the destruction of Kepler's Gate was a victory for humanity. But sitting in my quarters aboard the refugee transport, listening to the quiet sobbing of the few survivors who had managed to escape, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of victory required the murder of an entire world. What kind of civilization survived by consuming its own children? What kind of future were we preserving through the systematic destruction of everything that made life worth living? The orcs were gone, their plans for expansion eliminated before they could mature into sector-threatening operations. The immediate danger had passed, and humanity could continue its endless struggle for survival in a galaxy that offered nothing but war and death and the constant threat of extinction. We had won by any reasonable measure, so why did it feel like we had lost everything that mattered? The transport carrying the Kepler's Gate survivors reached the processing station at Mordian Prime 6 weeks after the exterminatus. We were processed like any other refugees, our skills assessed and our loyalty verified before being assigned to new worlds where the Imperium needed our particular capabilities. The survivors were scattered across dozens of planets, their former lives erased as completely as their homeworld had been. I received new orders assigning me to a fresh regiment being raised for deployment against orc forces in the Segmentum Tempestus. The irony wasn't lost on me. I would spend the rest of my career fighting the same aliens that had consumed my world, engaging in the same brutal campaigns that would inevitably end with more worlds destroyed and more populations scattered to the winds. But I would carry with me the memory of what we had lost, the knowledge of what humanity becomes when it prioritizes survival over everything that makes survival worthwhile. The orcs had been terrible in their alien brutality, their treatment of human prisoners beyond forgiveness or understanding. But we had responded to their monstrosity by becoming monstrous ourselves, murdering our own people to deny them to our enemies. The galaxy is vast and full of horrors that threaten the survival of our species. Alien empires that view humanity as prey. Chaos gods that seek to corrupt our souls. Ancient technologies that turn our own creations against us. Against such enemies, any price seems reasonable, any sacrifice justified, any atrocity acceptable if it preserves mankind for another generation. But in our desperation to survive, we risk losing sight of what we're trying to preserve. In our determination to defeat our enemies, we become indistinguishable from them. In our willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good, we discover that nothing remains good enough to be worth the sacrifice. The Emperor protects, they say. But who protects us from the choices we make in his name? Who saves us from the necessity that transforms loyal servants into mass murderers? Who preserves our humanity when survival demands that we abandon everything human? I don't know. I suspect no one does. But I remember Kepler's Gate, and the 4.2 billion people who died there, and the choice we made to kill our own world rather than lose it to aliens. I remember, and in remembering I bear witness to the price of our survival. The screaming stopped 3 days ago. The smell never will.